Hey there and welcome. This is Amber Fox with the Homeschooling Housewife here with me today, and I'm Lisa Yvonne from Graceful Abandon. We are here to talk to you about something that we thought was pretty nifty in the book of Joshua, chapter 4. Now, if you remember, the nation of Israel has been through a lot. About 40 some odd years before, they were slaves in Egypt. God led them out, miraculously delivered them, provided for them. They wandered around in the wilderness, and now it's time for them to fully take a hold of the promise that he had given them, and Joshua is their leader. So in chapter 4, it says, when all the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan and carry them out and pile them up at the place where you will camp tonight. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had chosen, one from each of the tribes of Israel. He told them, go into the middle of the Jordan in front of the ark of the Lord your God. Each of you must pick up one stone and carry it out on your shoulder, 12 stones in all, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. We will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask you, what do these stones mean? Then you can tell them, they remind us that the Jordan stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever. So we have a few things going on here. The first is a miracle. When the presence of God, which dwelt over the Ark of the Covenant, moved into the river, the Jordan stopped flowing so the people could walk on dry ground. This was pretty amazing to them, even though they had done this at the Red Sea, although there were new children among them who hadn't seen that. And the second thing we have going on is God saying, this is important enough that you're going to build an altar here, an altar of remembrance, and this pile of rocks is going to stay here. So we know that these are not little pebbles, they're big rocks, and they had to carry them out on their shoulders. And your children are going to see this pile, and they are going to say, why did you do this thing? And it's going to be so that you can say, they remind us that when the Jordan River stopped flowing, when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across it. So as parents, as generational leaders, the tribes of Israel and these men that Joshua selected from them were called to set up an altar of remembrance for future generations to point back to what God had done for them. Amber, what do you think about that as a mom? What do you think that tells us about family discipleship?
I think it is so important that we are constantly doing that in our kids' lives and that they know that our trust is really constant protect as we really demonstrate that in our lives, our kids will see it. And it really reminds me of an actual situation we had in our family about 6 years ago. My husband is a pastor, and for a while we had felt called away from the church that we were at, not for any particular reason, but just because he just felt like our time there was finished. But we just weren't really sure what God wanted for us, and yet we knew he was prompting us. And so we prayed about it, and before we talked to our church, we did it kind of in an unusual order. Most pastors will find and secure a church, then they'll let their congregation and their family know, and then they'll go to whatever the next thing is. And we just talked and we just really felt God was calling us to step out in faith. And so we decided, well, we can't argue with that. And so we gathered our kids together in this verse, Genesis 12:1, reading out of the New Living Translation. It says, the Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. And while we know that wasn't specifically God talking to us, we know that God is the same God yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so we could trust that if he could work that way in Abram's life, then he could also do that for us. So my husband gathered a stone, just like you're talking about, and we gathered up our kids. We had 5 or 4.5, I think it was at the time. And we pulled them together into our living room. We sat in a circle, and he held up a rock and he said, we do not know where God is calling us. He read this passage that I just showed you, and he said, we have no idea what God is doing in our lives, but we know that he's calling us to trust him. And so he held up this rock, much like you're talking about in the Old Testament, and he said, this is going to serve as our remembrance that God is our rock and that we can trust him And when we waver and when we're afraid that we aren't sure if we can trust that he actually knows what he's doing, we can remember that this is the moment where he's calling us to set up this altar of remembrance and really look to him and trust his faithfulness, even though we had no idea. And that led our family on a journey of about 1.5 years of really seeking the Lord's will for us before he ultimately brought us to the ministry we're in now. And we still hold on to that rock, not as a promise that God would give us an easy way, but as a promise and an indication, really a reminder of God's faithfulness. And there were many times we cried out to God together, the two of us, and we looked at that rock and we said, God, remind us, help us to remember that you are faithful and you love us and you want what's best for us. And so as we trusted him, we set up that altar of remembrance, and we would point to it when our kids would say, well, what are we going to do? And they got weary and waiting and wondering. We could say, we don't know God's timing, but he's faithful and we trust him. So I think it's so important to bring that into your kids' lives and let them really see God in a tangible way, and to let them know that sometimes your faith wavers too. Sometimes we struggle and we don't always trust him perfectly. So that's okay. That's okay for our kids to see. But that altar of remembrance to me was just like the pinnacle of our family really coming together and having a faith that united us and a remembrance of him.
I think that's really awesome. We have, my husband and I each have moments in our childhood and teenage years before we got married that stand out to us. And recently, one of my teenagers was sharing something with me, and I thought, oh, yeah, I have something that relates to that. But I actually debated about sharing it because it made me seem incredibly human and flawed, because I certainly wasn't perfect when I was younger. And I was rather rebellious, and I got into some trouble, and that kind of related to where they were at. And I shared that story with them, and I showed them a piece of jewelry that I had picked up for myself at a flea market. And it was when I saw it, I just felt like God said, you're like this. You're old, you're tarnished, but you can be polished up and redeemed. I can take you and I can make you new. And so after I had been through this rough season, I got this piece of jewelry and I polished it and I wore it. And so I was able to pull it out of my jewelry box. And I then shared with my child how in Joshua 4, these rocks were similar to that. It was a little memory keepsake of something that God had done that was faithful. And then I encouraged them to grab a little memento, or even just to write something down in their journal to remember all the times that God is faithful, because there are moments when we're overwhelmed by the situations that we're in, and we don't always think about those little times that God is faithful, or even the big ones, because all we can see is where we're at. And it's those moments from our past where we've seen him and the knowledge that he is the same yesterday and today forever that can, give us that peace. When we can't have the peace where we're at now, we can have the peace in who God is and what we know to be true about him. And that is that he is faithful, that he is loving, that he is good, that he is the giver of peace, that he is the provider. There have been so many times in our lives that we have run the checking account down to like 13 cents and 60 cents and 72 cents. I can remember them over and over. And we never went without. God just always provided. And we just sit there and pray, okay, God, now what? And he would always send something. And those little moments where God would just have groceries dropped off or a bill taken care of or a job that we could take, stood us over and over and over as a reminder that God provides. But then one time we found ourselves in another country in the middle of an international adoption with a $1,200 expense that came up, and we didn't have the money to cover it. And I just smiled and I said to the lawyer, it's okay, we'll have it for you. When do you need it? And they said, Lisa, we've seen your financials. You don't have it. And I said, it's okay, we will. When do you need it? And she's like, in the morning. And I said, that's no problem. That's okay. It'll be here. God did not bring us here to not provide for this. This is just one more way for him to be glorified. And she said, okay. Well, not 10 minutes later, my phone rings, and the girl who was house sitting for us said, somebody dropped off $200. and they want me to get it to you right now. Can I wire it over? I said, that would be wonderful. And so I said to the kids, okay, we're going to pray because now we just need $1,000. And they kind of looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, remember all the times that God has provided up till now? He is not going to be any different today. If he called us to this, then he's providing for it. And it's for his glory. He's doing it his way, not our way, because I would much prefer to have not been in this situation. And another friend of ours woke up in the middle of the night because it was nighttime in the States, and woke his wife up and said, we're supposed to pray for the Tucker family right now. And so they prayed for us. And at the end of that prayer, God moved on them to wire over $1,000. And they had no clue why.
That's awesome.
And so within like 2 hours, we had all the money we needed and then some, because it was $1,200 was the minimum. And it was, it was like, okay, what do we do now? And then we were able to save money on some other expenses there. And God just moved it all along. And it was such a beautiful, beautiful testimony. But I don't know that I would have been able to stand in that place calmly and with that assurance had God not done all of those other things that we always look back on and praise him for.
Yeah, and that testimony is just amazing, what our God can do and does. And I think that leads me into the encouragement of the preparation he gave you to come to that moment. Many, many times it comes through struggle. And so, I would just encourage anyone listening right now that if you're in that time of struggle and wondering, where is God? Cling to him. Make that pillar of remembrance and really just ask God to make himself clear to you, to make himself known, because you don't know what he's preparing you for in the future. And we've just seen time and time again, this video would take way too long if we both shared all the testimonies of what God has done in our lives. But just to see that he is faithful and he's calling his people to remembrance so that in those times, because he knew in the future they would look back and forget. And so he's asking us to do the same, put up those altars and those pinnacles so that you can look back and remember God is faithful. And if you're in that time of trying right now where it just feels like, where are you, God? And I'm stumbling through the dark. I have no idea how to even find you right now. Remember the past and what God has done. If you can't see it in your own life, then as you read through scripture, as you do this 90-day Bible challenge, just look at God's faithfulness with his people and let it sit and saturate your heart and be a testimony of, this is the same God. We keep saying it, and he saves his people and he redeems them and he provides. He loves you. And so I think that's the biggest thing is, if you're struggling right now in your faith, just to remember and to reach out, to remember what God has done. And if you're in a time of plenty, then be setting up those altars right now, because there will come a time when your faith is challenged and you'll need to remember, like you said, I love what you said about telling your kids, write it down or get a keepsake or something. Like for us, it was the rock, because in the times ahead that were unstable and difficult, we were able to look back at that and say, God is faithful and he never changes. So I think there's a lot of encouragement in this passage to be had here, just looking at it and remembering, in our own lives, we need to do the same.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Amber. I have come to really look forward to our weekly chats about what we're getting in these verses. And y'all, if you want to learn more about Amber, of course, I'll link to her website below this post, but she is the homeschooling housewife, and she has an awesome book out on Amazon. Even if you don't homeschool, she offers encouragement on how to juggle all the priorities of being a wife and a mom, and I totally encourage you to check it out. It's fantastic. You guys have a great week. Keep reading the Word. If you're getting behind or overwhelmed, don't worry about it, because it's not about doing the Bible in 90 days so much as it is reading the Bible cover to cover and seeing everything that God has and how it all works together. And this is just a small part of it. But it's so encouraging and it's so beautiful. And reading about this altar of remembrance is even more powerful to me because I've read about Exodus and all of the law that they have to follow, and then the beauty of God taking care of the next generation. God is a generational God, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, not just the God of Abraham. He cared about each generation that came after them. And just as he cares about you, he cares about your children. And until the day that he comes back, he's going to always care about the next generation because he is their God as well. And that's what this is all about, family discipleship and sharing God with more and more people and sharing the love of Jesus. So y'all just keep reading the word, putting it in your heart and putting it out there in your life because it doesn't ever return void. God is so faithful to reap a harvest. Have a blessed week.